That's like classical theism, and we only have about like 10-15 minutes left, so I know there's a lot here that could be said. So don't feel like you have to get through everything if you deep. But like a lot of people will say, like, well, open theism will conflict with classical theism with things like divine simplicity, immutability, impassibility, like actuality, or like collapsing like the creator-creature distinction, like things like that.
Yeah.
So how would you kind of approach the idea of like someone objecting that it can just conflicts with classical theism?
All right. Yeah. So well after the period of the early church, well, starting with people like Augustine and Boethius, and then moving on through Anselm and Aquinas, is kind of like the crowning type of figure here in framing what's come to be known as classical theism. Yeah. This is a view of God that adds on to just the standard stuff. God created everything ex nihilo, and God is omnipotent, is all good, he's all-knowing and stuff like that. He's triune, he's personal, like standard type of theistic package. They add on a number of other things, such as God is absolutely simple, that God is identical to his essence, and everything intrinsic to God is essential to God. Or that God is pure act, and God cannot be actually affected in any way by anything outside of himself. He can't be really affected by creatures. He doesn't stand in any real relation to creation. Or that God is absolutely mutable or absolutely timeless. These types of declarations about God's nature were derived by drawing on Greek philosophy, particularly Plato and Aristotle, to arrive at a certain conception of God. And those who hold this view will insist quite strongly that if you don't say these things about God, then you have, you've got, you have a view that runs counter to the proper distinction between creator and creature. Your God is less than God should be. My response to this, without having time to get into any details, is to say that, when you look closely at the arguments for these conclusions, they invariably rest on a philosophical assumption that's derived usually, either in most cases either from Plato or from Aristotle, and that these assumptions can be rationally denied. We aren't required to accept it. So I'll give a couple quick examples, and I think that'll probably be all I have time for. So with respect to divine immutability, one line of argument that goes back to Plato was that, well, God can't change in any respect because God is absolutely perfect. And so if God were to change in any respect, it would either be for the better, which is impossible because God can't get any better, or for the worse, which is impossible because God is essentially perfect, and so it can't get any worse. So God can't change. To which I would say, well, why think that all change must be for the better or for the worst? Why can't some change be lateral, so to speak? Be evaluatively neutral? If creation is dynamically changing, as open theists believe, and as anyone who as I think most of us intuitively believe, then God's knowledge of creation should also change to just keep in sync with reality, right? God has to be on top of what's going on, right? That's not a change for the better. God's knowledge is always perfect. It's not a change for the worse. It's the kind of change that you want in a clock that's keeping accurate time. It's staying in sync with things. So I would say that assumption from Plato, all change must be for the better or the worse, it's just a false assumption. It doesn't stand up to close scrutiny. Another one, to use a case that comes out of Aquinas. His argument for that God must be pure act. It comes out of his argument in the first way. His argument, his first argument for God's existence. And one of the assumptions he relies on there is he says, he starts with this example of this log being heated by a fire. And he, so the log is in potency with respect to being hot. The fire is in act with respect to being hot, and being brought close to the fire heats the log and actualizes a potency in the log. So the log undergoes a change as a result of this. And so he then states this general principle. He says, let me see. Anything that is moved or changed, altered, is moved by something else. And he states this as a kind of general principle. He tries in his other of the Summa, like the contra. In the Summa Contra Gentiles, he does offer some arguments on behalf of this principle that he derives straight out of Aristotle's physics. But he's generalizing this claim. Everything is moved, has to be moved by something else. And therefore, we can't, he says, can't go on to infinity in this. And so we have to come to a first unmoved mover. And he uses that principle to establish that God must be purely actual. Is it true that everything moved has to be moved by something else? I can think of some counterexamples to that. Think of Newtonian, of Newton's views about motion, right? You have an object moving in space, linear motion. According to Newton, the object doesn't need any force acting on it in order to keep moving.
Yeah.
Right? So something is moving without being moved by anything else. It just keeps on going unless something acts upon it to slow it down or change its motion. And the other type of counterexample, I would say, well, how about free will? If nothing can be moved unless something else moves it, well, then there could be no free will. That principle that Aquinas derives from Aristotelian physics rules out the very possibility of creaturely freedom. In fact, it rules out, if any change in a thing has to be produced in that thing by something else, well, then I can't have it, affect a change in my own will. Right, by making a free decision between this and that, because that would be a change in me that would have to be, I would need an agent outside of me to cause that, which means I'm not a free agent, right? I'm not the one ultimately responsible for my choices. So if you follow this principle through to its logical conclusion, you land in a place that I don't think most of us want to be. And that gives us, I think, a reason for questioning that philosophical assumption. And once you question that, then the case for God's pure actuality and God's absolute immutability and stuff like this starts to look a lot weaker. So I think you can by looking closely at the assumptions that are made in the arguments, I think you can dismantle the case for classical theism. At least for those specific attributions, God absolutely simple, absolutely immutable, God is timeless, and so forth. I think they all rest on philosophical.